Hi, I'm Venora. My father once said something that changed my life forever. But before I tell you what it was, I should tell you about the silence. In my family, silence was a language all its own. It was the space between my father's pronouncements and my mother's sighs. It was the air I learned to breathe, the currency I used to purchase peace. For 33 years, I thought being quiet was the same as being good. I was wrong. The lesson began on a Tuesday in October, the kind of day that can't decide between autumn and winter, and so it settles for a cold, persistent rain. The rain wasn't just falling. It hammered down like the sky itself wanted to punish someone. I stood frozen on my small apartment porch, fingers tight around the rusted iron railing, watching the woman who raised me, my grandmother Ada, shiver on the steps of my father's house across the street. She was holding two things, a small, battered suitcase with a broken latch and her chipped white teacup. That teacup. She'd had it longer than I'd been alive, a delicate piece of porcelain with a tiny bluebird painted on the side, its wings forever in mid-flight. And still, he left her standing there. Hours earlier, inside that house, I'd heard my father's voice cut through the air like a shard of glass. She's dying soon. Stop wasting money on her. I remember the way those words sat heavy in the air, how they seemed to suck all the warmth from the room. I remember how I opened my mouth to speak, to argue, to plead, and how the heavy oak door slammed in my face before a single word could escape. Now, from the shadows of my own porch, I watched as Ada stood still, drenched, her frail shoulders shaking from more than just the cold. I should have gone to her sooner, but there was something paralyzing about seeing the woman who once carried me on her hip, who taught me how to tie my shoes and how to find constellations in the summer sky, now treated like a piece of refuse by her own son. When I finally moved, it was like pushing through mud. I rushed down the 3 concrete steps and crossed the narrow, sodden yard that separated our worlds. Grandma. My voice cracked, lost in the rhythm of the rain. Her eyes met mine. They were confused, lost, but not surprised. The lack of surprise was the cruelest part. They said I'm a burden now, Venora. Her voice was a fragile whisper. I had no answer, only shame. I took her suitcase with one hand, its flimsy handle cold and wet, and wrapped my arm around her small frame with the other. I led her away from that house, my father's porch light flickering behind us like a malevolent eye. Inside my apartment, the air was warm, but it couldn't touch the chill that had settled deep in my bones. I peeled her soaked coat from her shoulders. The skin underneath was pale, cold to the touch. I wrapped her in my best blanket, a soft wool throw I'd saved for, but it felt like a pitifully small gesture against such a vast betrayal. Sit here, Grandma. My voice sounded wrong in the quiet of my own home, shaky and thin. I sat her down on the worn floral couch and ran to put water on for tea. Not that tea fixes betrayal, but it's what you do, isn't it? It's the ritual you perform when you don't know what else to do. As the kettle began to hiss, I turned to look at her. She was holding that chipped teacup in both hands, cradling it in her lap like it was the last piece of her life she could still claim. I wanted to ask her why. Why she gave him the house, the deed, everything. But she spoke first, her voice barely audible over the kettle's rising scream. He's my son, Venora. I don't understand. Neither did I. But in that moment, what hit harder than her confusion was my own silence. I poured the tea, added just a little sugar, the way she'd always liked it, and placed the warm mug in her hands. She sipped slowly, her hands trembling less than before, but her eyes remained distant, fixed on a past I couldn't see. I sat across from her, unable to stop watching her. Somewhere in the hum of the rain and the faint tick of my kitchen clock, my mind wandered back to being 10 years old. To my father's voice echoing down the hallway, "Don't talk back." To my mother's silence every time I looked to her for help. And to me, sitting there, learning how to stay quiet. Because silence in our family wasn't just survival, it was expected. But tonight, staring at my grandmother shaking under my blanket, her lips pale around that chipped porcelain rim, I wondered something I'd never dared to before. Is silence the same as cruelty? I didn't have the answer. I pulled my knees up to my chest, hugging them, watching the woman who once sewed my Halloween costumes and braided my hair, now reduced to someone tossed into a storm. She's dying soon. That wasn't just a sentence. It was a judgment. I don't remember falling asleep, only the steady sound of rain and the distant crack of thunder. As Grandma drifted into an exhausted sleep on my couch, I stayed awake. And somewhere around 3 a.m., staring at the water-stained ceiling, I whispered words I didn't even know I believed until they left my mouth. I don't think I can forgive them this time. The kettle's whistle had faded into silence hours ago, but sleep never came. I sat at the small kitchen table, staring into the shadows as Grandma dozed on my couch, her hands curled around that chipped teacup, even in sleep. The apartment was still, except for the rain that still pattered against the window pane. And yet, all I could hear was his voice. She's dying soon. Stop wasting money on her. That sentence had taken root in me. I could feel it like splinters under my skin. I closed my eyes, and just like that, I was back in their house. Earlier that day, before the storm, before the shouting, before the door slammed. There we were, standing around the polished mahogany dining table like strangers, preparing for a hostile negotiation. The recessed lighting was too bright, the air too thick with unspoken things. My father, Owen, sat at the head of the table, a stack of legal documents spread out before him, neat and orderly. He looked at Grandma not like his mother, but like a line item on a budget he needed to zero out. "It just makes sense, Mother," he'd said, in that careful, condescending tone of his. The one he used when he was explaining something he believed was far beyond your comprehension. We're simplifying things. Avoiding legal hassles down the road. I watched Ada hesitate, her hand hovering over the paper, a fine-tipped pen trembling between her gnarled fingers. "It's my house," she whispered, her voice frail against the solid wood of the table. "Why? Why no?" "Because," he said flatly, his patience wearing thin. "You're 82, Mom. You've had a good life." The silence that followed was louder than the rain that now lashed against my window. She signed. I still remember the sound of it, the dry, hesitant scratch of her pen as she wrote her name, then lowered the pen as if it had drained the last of her strength. I looked at my mother, Maeve, across the table, silently begging her with my eyes to intervene, to say something, anything. Maeve just sat there, her hands folded primly in her lap. She nodded once, a tight, small gesture. Not in agreement, but in compliance. My father gathered the papers, stacked them precisely, and placed them in a leather briefcase with a decisive snap. "That's done." I stood up then, my chair scraping against the hardwood floor. "Dad, don't." His glare stopped me cold. "You've taken everything she owns," I said, my voice shaking with a rage I hadn't known I possessed. "And you're still not done, are you?" His jaw tightened. "This isn't your business, Venora. She's my grandmother. She's my mother." He said it with a finality that left no room for argument. I couldn't speak. I couldn't move. And he knew it. What came next was worse. He turned to Ada, not as a son, but as a man talking to someone irrelevant. "You're old. You're dying soon. Stop wasting our money." The words weren't shouted. That would have been better. He said them casually, as if explaining a grocery bill. I remember the way Ada blinked once, twice, as if she hadn't understood at first. Then her shoulders folded in on themselves. She looked smaller, breakable. And my mother, she stood up and walked toward the hallway. I waited for her to turn, to say something. She didn't. She turned her back. I stood there, useless, watching as my father guided Ada toward the front door as if she were luggage he needed out of the house. "Goodbye, Mom," he said, his voice devoid of any emotion. I should have done something. I should have screamed, fought, thrown something. But I froze. I watched him open the door. I watched the first drops of rain start to soak her thin sweater the second she stepped outside. I watched. Back in my apartment, I reached for the blanket I'd thrown over her hours earlier, tucking it more securely around her shoulders, even though she was still asleep. Her breathing was light, shallow. She hadn't let go of the teacup. I got up slowly and moved toward the bathroom. I didn't turn on the harsh overhead light, just the small one above the mirror. My reflection looked wrong. 33 years old, working as a paralegal at a downtown firm, handling other people's conflicts for a living. And yet, when it came to my own family, I'd said nothing. I braced my hands against the cool porcelain of the sink. I've been silent all my life. It wasn't just today. It wasn't just tonight. I thought about all the years of hearing my father's lectures, my mother's sighs, the decisions made without me, around me, despite me. And I thought I was keeping the peace. I thought silence meant I was choosing grace. But tonight, I'd watched my grandmother, the woman who held my hand through every childhood fear, get thrown into a storm like a piece of old furniture. And I hadn't stopped it. Tears burned behind my eyes, but I refused to let them fall. My silence didn't keep the peace. It enabled cruelty. I gripped the edge of the sink until my knuckles ached. Maybe I am the coward. Morning came gray and heavy. I hadn't really slept, though I must have drifted off at some point because the kettle was cold when I touched it and Ada was still on the couch, her small frame curled around that chipped teacup like it was the last thing holding her together. I moved slowly, quietly. My body felt stiff, as if I'd been holding a single, tense position all night long. Maybe I had. In the kitchen, I made toast. Plain, dry, just enough to put something in her stomach. Coffee brewed black, sharp, the way I knew she liked it, a habit from decades of early mornings. I didn't ask if she was hungry. I just set the plate and mug on the little end table beside the couch. Ada stirred, blinking slowly, her fine, white hair sticking out in wisps. When her eyes found mine, they were too clear, too awake for someone just roused from sleep. "Why did he do it?" she asked softly. I opened my mouth, then closed it again. She sat up, her hands trembling slightly as she reached for the teacup still resting in her lap, raising it carefully to sip the air out of pure habit. I poured the fresh coffee into it without a word. She took a small sip, the chipped rim pressing against her pale lips. "Why did he do it, Venora?" I couldn't answer. Because he could. Because no one ever told him no. Because I never told him no. My throat felt tight. I sat in the armchair across from her but couldn't meet her eyes. I studied the worn pattern on the rug instead. The silence between us stretched thin, brittle as glass. Her voice broke it. "Your father, he wasn't always like this." I swallowed hard. "Did you ever tell him no?" Ada's gaze shifted down to the cup in her hands. She didn't answer. Neither did I. The minutes dragged, filled only with the soft clink of porcelain when she set the teacup down. Then my phone buzzed on the kitchen counter. I reached for it automatically, my heart sinking before I even looked at the screen. A text from Owen. "Stop interfering. This is family business. You'll understand when you have your own children." I stared at the message, the words blurring. My hands felt cold. Another message flashed through almost immediately after, this one from Maeve. "Dad's just stressed. Don't make things harder." I sat motionless, reading those two sentences over and over. Two perfectly crafted dismissals. My anger was an interference, an immaturity I'd eventually outgrow. My mother's text wasn't an apology, it was a command disguised as concern. As if I was the one overreacting, as if their betrayal wasn't a real and tangible thing, but a phase I'd get over. I didn't reply. I didn't even think. I just held my finger down on their message threads and hit delete. I watched their words vanish from the screen as if they'd never existed. Part of me expected relief. Instead, my chest felt heavier. Ada must have seen the look on my face because she whispered, "What did he say?" I shook my head. "Nothing that matters." She didn't push. That hurt more than if she had. I cleared the plates, needing something, anything, to do with my hands. Washing dishes felt safer than thinking. But my mind betrayed me. As I scrubbed the same plate over and over, a memory hit me like a splash of cold water. I was 12 again, sitting on the bottom step of the stairs after knocking over a glass vase in the living room. My mother's voice came from the kitchen, soft and conspiratorial. "Just keep quiet, Venora. It's easier that way." I'd believed her. I'd believed silence was safer. Every time something went wrong, every time Dad's anger filled the house like a tangible presence, every time Mom went quiet instead of standing up, I'd mirrored her. Silent, obedient, invisible. I rinsed the soap from the plate and realized my hands were shaking. I went back to the living room and sat on the floor beside the couch. Ada had drifted off again, the teacup resting precariously in her lap. I stared at the lines on her face, the exhaustion etched into every wrinkle. This ends with me. I didn't know what that meant yet, what it would cost. But I knew I couldn't be quiet anymore. I looked at her, watching her chest rise and fall, listening to the fragile sound of her breathing. And I whispered the first real truth I'd admitted to myself in years. The words hung in the air long after I spoke them. I'm not my mother. But in the quiet of my apartment, doubt crept in like a slow fog. I stood there for what felt like forever, staring at the blank screen of my phone. The weight of all the silence I'd ever kept filled the room, heavy and choking. At some point, I found myself dialing. I didn't even remember walking to the kitchen or sitting down at the table. My fingers just moved, almost on their own. Owen's name glared back at me from the screen. I hesitated. Then I hit call. It rang once, twice, and then his voice came through, sharp and impatient. What? I forced my own voice steady. Why did you do it? A pause. I could almost hear him smirking through the line. What are you talking about now, Venora? You know what I'm talking about. The silence stretched. Then came the laugh, cold and short. This isn't your concern. My breath hitched. She's your mother. And you. His voice turned mocking. What have you ever contributed to this family? To anything that matters? I swallowed hard. Don't call me again about this. You'll understand when you grow up. Or when you finally have kids of your own. And, just like that, the call ended. I stared at the screen, hearing the hollow beep in my ear. For a long time, I just sat there, not crying, not thinking, just empty. When the knock at the door came later that evening, I almost ignored it. But something made me get up, walk down the short hall, and open it. Maeve stood there. Not a text this time, not a voicemail. She had come in person. She looked around my small apartment with that same pained expression she always wore when she visited, like she'd stepped into a motel that smelled faintly of bleach and regret. I didn't know you still lived here, she said softly, stepping inside without waiting for an invitation. I said nothing. She spotted Ada's sleeping form on the couch and immediately lowered her voice. I came to check on her. Did you? The words were quiet, but they held a new edge. She ignored that. She always did. I know you're upset, Maeve began carefully, choosing her words like she was diffusing a bomb. But Dad's under a lot of pressure. You know how he gets. She paused, waiting for me to nod, to agree, to make it easy for her. I didn't. Don't make things harder for him. I folded my arms, my silence a wall she wasn't used to. I just don't want you wasting your life over this, Venora. She paused, brushing invisible dust from her expensive jacket sleeve. You've always had potential. Don't throw it away trying to be a hero. She tilted her head, her voice softening in that practiced way she used when she wanted me to feel like a stubborn child. Maybe it's time to think about other options. Professional options. A nursing home could take better care of her than you can in this apartment. I said nothing. Her eyes flicked toward Ada's small form wrapped in blankets. Don't sacrifice your life for someone whose time is up. I felt my throat close, but I still didn't speak. I watched Maeve shift, uncomfortable in the silence she hadn't expected. Finally, she let out a soft sigh. I'll tell Dad you're just being emotional. She left, and I let her. The door clicked shut behind her. I sank onto the floor, pulling my knees to my chest, and finally let the tears fall. Maybe they were right. Maybe I was being foolish. Maybe this tiny apartment, this chipped teacup, this frail woman asleep in my living room wasn't worth throwing my entire life away for. My phone was back in my hand before I realized it. I hovered over Owen's name. My finger trembled above the call button. I could apologize. I could say I'd overreacted. I could pretend none of this ever happened. Ada would be sent somewhere safe, and I could go back to whatever life I thought I had. I closed my eyes. Then, a voice, barely audible. Don't let them decide. I turned, my heart lurching. Ada's eyes were open. Her voice was fragile, but her gaze was clear. Don't let them decide for you, Venora. And suddenly, everything I felt cracked open. I wasn't just angry at them. I was angry at myself for thinking, even for a second, that they were right. For believing that silence was safer. For almost handing my strength back to the very people who'd taught me to bury it. I looked down at my phone. I didn't press call. Instead, I set it down on the table, next to the chipped teacup with its little bluebird. I looked at the woman who had fought harder than anyone deserved to and now lay broken in my home. I won't, I whispered. It felt like a promise. But by morning, the weight of reality pressed harder than ever. The first envelope arrived as I was pouring black coffee, its bitter scent thin in the air. I tore it open without thinking, expecting another grocery coupon or a late bill. Instead, the letterhead was from the local hospital. Ada's emergency care from the night I'd brought her in, shivering from the rain. $3,000, due in 2 weeks. A second envelope followed before noon. Labs, prescriptions, follow-up appointments. I didn't need to do the math. I already knew my savings, what little I'd scraped together from overtime hours at the firm, wouldn't stretch. Not with rent, not with groceries, not with her. I sat down at the small table in my kitchen and laid out every bill, every statement, every number that defined my small existence. The numbers didn't lie. But neither did the silence from the couch where Ada slept, curled like something fragile the world had forgotten. I'm not strong enough for this, I whispered to no one. I stayed there until the coffee went cold. That night, as Ada drifted into an uneasy sleep beside me on the pull-out sofa bed, I let myself cry. Silently, small, as if keeping the tears quiet enough would mean they didn't count. At some point, the tears stopped, but the ache stayed. I lay awake, staring at the cracked plaster of the ceiling, when a memory surfaced, clear and sharp. I must have been 5, maybe 6. It was winter. I'd lost my coat somehow, left it at school, I think. I remembered my parents arguing about it, their voices sharp behind their closed bedroom door. I remembered feeling cold, shivering by the living room window. And then Ada, quiet as always, kneeling beside me with a bright red scarf. To keep you warm, always, she had whispered. She wrapped it around my neck with careful hands, tucking the ends close to my heart. No lecture, no anger. Just warmth. No one else had ever done that. I remembered that scarf. I'd lost it years later. But the feeling of it stayed. And tonight, lying in the dark, I felt the cold all over again. The next morning brought another blow. A letter, this time certified. I signed for it with hands I barely recognized as my own. Inside was the official deed transfer. Ada's house. The house I'd played in as a child, with its creaking staircase and the smell of pine in the backyard, was now Owen's. Officially, legally, irrevocably. I sat down on the floor, the deed in my hand, and felt something inside me fracture. They hadn't even waited for her to die. They'd taken it while she was still breathing. I found myself drafting a message on my phone, my thumbs moving before thought could catch up. You stole what was never yours. I stared at the words. Deleted them. Typed again. You took her future while she watched. Deleted. I set the phone down. Sat there in silence, holding the cold plastic like it might burn me. Ada stirred in her sleep, murmuring something I couldn't catch. And in that moment, I understood. This wasn't about a house. It was about erasure. They weren't just stealing property, they were erasing her, one signature at a time. And I had let them. I stood up. I don't remember putting on my coat. I just remembered walking. It was raining again. Not a storm, just a steady, relentless drizzle, enough to soak skin through to bone. I stood outside Owen's house for a long time. The wrought iron gate was locked. The porch lights were on. I could see their shadows moving behind the drawn curtains. I didn't knock. I didn't yell. I didn't even cry. I just stood there watching, breathing. And when the cold finally sank deep enough, when the rain traced lines down my cheeks like tears I refused to let fall, I whispered to the house that once held every Christmas, every birthday, every piece of my childhood. This ends. The words echoed in my head as I walked home from Owen's house, soaked through, my shoes heavy with water. I didn't remember leaving the gate or how long I had stood there in the rain. I only remembered the weight in my chest. Not anger anymore. Something colder, clearer. When I reached my apartment, everything felt too still. The kind of silence that isn't peace, but a warning. I opened the door and knew. Ada wasn't on the couch. I found her in the bedroom, crumpled on the floor beside the bed, her breathing ragged, her skin a waxy, pale color. Sweat beaded at her hairline. An empty prescription bottle lay on its side. A note sat folded on the nightstand. I didn't need to read it to know who it was from, but I did. Enough suffering. Maeve's handwriting. Calm, deliberate. I didn't scream. I couldn't. My body moved on instinct, my fingers dialing 911 before my mind could catch up. I told the dispatcher our address, her age, her condition. The words felt like they were coming from someone else's voice. The ambulance came fast, its lights flashing red against the wet street, but every second felt endless. At the hospital, I watched strangers in scrubs work to save Ada while I stood uselessly in the corridor. Somewhere inside me, something cracked. Not like glass shattering, not sharp and loud, but like old wood splitting. A slow, deep fracture. When a nurse finally told me she had been stabilized, that she was resting, I nodded as if I'd heard her. I'm not sure I did. I sat in the waiting room, drenched, my hair plastered to my face, a small pool of water forming under my chair. No one looked at me. No one spoke. And there, sitting in that cold, brightly lit place, something inside me changed. I wasn't sad. I wasn't scared. I was angry. Not the kind of anger that burns. The kind that freezes. I left the hospital without thinking. I drove through the rain, the streets blurry through the windshield, the tires sliding at every stoplight. By the time I reached Owen's house again, the sky had started to fade from black to gray, but the rain didn't stop. I stood at the gate, pressed the buzzer, and waited. He opened the door himself, no hesitation. Have you finally come to your senses? His voice was casual, as if we were discussing the weather. I remembered, suddenly, being 5 years old, standing in this same doorway holding a broken doll, hearing that same tone when he told me to stop crying over junk. Not this time. No, I said. My voice was calm. Too calm. I'm here to remind you. You'll answer for every minute she suffered. He laughed. He actually laughed. Then he slammed the door. I stood there a few moments longer, listening to the solid echo of the lock clicking into place. The rain pressed against me, heavy as lead. But I wasn't moving. Not yet. Later that morning, I sat in a small, cluttered office at a legal aid clinic. I told them everything. Not the whole story, not yet. Just enough. Elder financial abuse. Coerced property theft. Negligent endangerment. The woman helping me, a tired-looking lawyer with kind eyes, didn't ask many questions. She just nodded, took notes, and asked for copies of the deed transfer, the hospital bills, and my grandmother's most recent medical assessment. By noon, the papers were filed. An emergency injunction to freeze all of Ada's former assets, including the house. It was the first blow. Owen received the notice that afternoon. I didn't see it happen. I didn't have to. Maeve called my phone 3 times within the hour. I didn't answer. I could imagine the conversation as clearly as if I stood in the room. Maeve, panicked. What did you do, Owen? What did you drag me into? Owen, cold and confident. She's bluffing. She doesn't have proof. I knew him well enough. That's why I wasn't bluffing. I sat in my car outside their house again. But this time, I didn't knock. I pulled out my phone and typed 2 words. Check your email. And I sent it. Inside that email was a single audio file. Ada's voice, fragile but steady, recorded in her hospital bed that morning. He said I was a burden, my son. He said my house was his now. He said I wasn't family anymore. It wasn't much, but it was a start. I watched the house. I waited. And this time I imagined Owen's silence. Not anger, not disbelief. Worry. I sat there in the rain, headlights dimmed, windshield wipers pushing away steady streams of water, each drop trailing down the glass like a crack forming. And I whispered to no one but myself, this isn't a bluff. I said it to the rain, to the night, to myself. But the next morning, it became real. By the time I woke, my phone had already exploded with notifications. Maeve hadn't wasted any time. A picture of me from years ago, smiling and young, was all over her social media, captioned with, "She's isolating our mother. We're worried she's being influenced. She refuses to let us visit. Please pray for Ada." And beneath it, hundreds of comments from strangers who didn't know me, didn't know us, didn't know anything. "She looks cold. Why would a granddaughter do that to her own grandma? She just wants the money." I didn't respond. I didn't scroll. I just sat on the edge of my bed, the phone resting on my knee, and listened to the silence pressing in around me. Minutes later, a text arrived from Owen himself. "Any fool can throw stones. But I build walls." I stared at that message longer than I should have. They thought they'd won. I let them think that. Court was scheduled for noon. By the time I walked into the courthouse, it felt like every eye knew me from Maeve's posts. But none of that mattered. Not now. Owen and Maeve stood near the entrance. Maeve's eyes flickered with something guilt? Fear, when she saw me. Owen didn't even glance my way. He was too busy shaking hands with their lawyer, a man in an impeccably tailored suit. I didn't look at them. I kept walking. Inside the courtroom, everything felt too big, too loud. Papers shuffling, voices murmuring, my own heartbeat thudding in my ears. I sat down next to my attorney, a woman named Clara from the clinic. She didn't smile. She didn't speak unless it was necessary. That's why I trusted her. The hearing started. Owen's lawyer stood first, calm and confident. She claimed my grandmother had been manipulated in her final months, that Ada's mental state had been questionable for some time, and that there were grave concerns about isolation and undue influence on my part. They had even prepared a forged medical note from some out-of-state psychiatrist, a man Ada had never even met. Then Maeve's accusations were read aloud, word for word, from her social media posts. They painted me as a predator, a thief. I listened to all of it. Then Clara stood. She didn't argue. She didn't fight back. Not yet. Instead, she handed a sealed envelope to the judge. "This," she said simply, "was notarized 8 months ago. It was discovered within the personal belongings of Ada Kinsley, hidden inside a personal item given to my client during her childhood." The judge frowned but opened the envelope. Inside was a folded piece of paper. I knew every crease. It was Ada's will. Her real will, hidden inside the lining of the red scarf she'd given me when I was a child. I remembered finding it by accident just days ago, a small, hard lump in the fabric as I folded it to put away. I had thought it was just a forgotten tag. Clara stepped aside, and I stood. I unfolded the paper with trembling fingers and read, "I know who will stand by me when I no longer stand for myself." Ada's words, her familiar, elegant handwriting, her truth. The room fell silent. Owen didn't move. Maeve's face strained of all color, her knuckles white against the dark wood of the bench. I kept reading. "I leave what I own, not to those who claim my blood, but to the one who stayed." The judge cleared his throat, visibly shaken. Owen's lawyer tried to protest, to claim it was a forgery, but no one listened. The judge ruled within minutes. Owen's access to Ada's estate was frozen, effective immediately. I was granted emergency authority pending a full investigation. When the gavel fell, the sound was flat and final. It didn't feel like victory. It felt like something heavier. I walked past Owen on my way out. He didn't speak. Neither did Maeve. And neither did I. In the parking lot, I sat behind the wheel of my car, my hands resting on the steering wheel, staring at nothing. I reached over, took the red scarf from my bag, and unfolded it slowly, as if it might vanish if I moved too fast. Ada's handwriting caught the sunlight filtering through the windshield. I traced the words once more. I breathed. And I said softly, not to the scarf, not to Ada, not even to myself, "I'm not done." That thought followed me like a pulse as I sat in silence, phone in hand, staring at the invitation I'd typed out. Simple, direct. "Meet me in 1 hour if you want this buried." No threat, no explanation. Just a line he'd understand. I pressed send. I wasn't sure if he'd show, but deep down I knew he would. Owen Kinsley didn't like loose ends. He arrived 47 minutes later, pulling up to my apartment building in his sleek black sedan, like he was still the one in control. He walked in without knocking, without a word. The rain from earlier had dried, but his coat dripped anyway, as if the weather clung to him. I didn't greet him. I led him to the small living room. No coffee, no small talk. A small digital voice recorder was already set in the center of the table. I watched his eyes flicker toward it. "Sit," I said quietly. He did. The silence hung for a moment, thick as the air before a storm. Then I pressed play. First, Ada's voice filled the apartment. "Why, Owen? Why are you taking the house?" I heard the quiver in her tone, even though I'd played the clip a dozen times by now. She'd sounded scared, small. Then Owen's voice answered, cold and clear. "Because your dying mother. And your worth is in that house. That's it." A pause. Then Ada again, her voice cracking. "You said you'd care for me." Another cold reply from my father. "I said what you needed to hear." I watched him listen to his own cruelty. His hands, once so steady, clenched the edges of the table. His eyes, usually sharp and assessing, stared at nothing. Maeve had recorded that conversation months ago, probably to protect herself. She'd deleted the file, thinking it was gone for good. But panic makes people careless, and discarded phones don't always wipe themselves. I had paid a specialist to retrieve it. Now it was mine. And his. I let the last few seconds of Ada's shaking breaths echo in the small room. Then I clicked stop. "Is that a bluff too?" I asked him softly. Owen didn't speak. For the first time in my life, he didn't have any words. And I realized then he wasn't powerful. He was hollow. "I used to wonder what you were afraid of," I said, standing up. "Turns out, it was just your own voice." He stood too, so abruptly that he knocked his chair back. But he didn't argue. He left without a single word. By the time I uploaded that audio file to the Attorney General's Elder Protection Task Force, my hands didn't shake anymore. The media caught the story within 24 hours. Local businessman accused in million-dollar fraud against elderly mother. They printed that headline beside Owen's corporate headshot. Maeve's name wasn't far behind. She cracked first. I watched the video clip online, just like everyone else. Her, standing on the courthouse steps, reporters crowding around her, her voice sharp and brittle. I told him not to do it. He forced me into all of this. I didn't know he'd hurt her. I didn't. I shut the clip off. Let them destroy each other. That night, I drove alone. No more hearings, no more lawyers, no more emails. Just me. Ada's grave was quiet when I arrived. The headstone was plain, simple. She wouldn't have wanted anything grand. I stood there for a long while, breathing in the cool night air, listening to the silence that no longer pressed against my skin like a punishment. Then I took the red scarf from my coat pocket. It was folded neatly. I placed it at the base of her headstone. "You're free now," I whispered. "And so am I." I didn't cry. I smiled. My phone buzzed in my jacket as I turned to leave. A new email. The subject line read, "Attorney General's Office, case opened." I let out a slow breath and whispered one last time, "This ends here." And I meant it. I didn't need the headlines anymore to confirm what I already knew. The Attorney General's office had filed formal charges against both Owen and Maeve. Elder exploitation, fraud, conspiracy. Their accounts were frozen, their names splashed across every local paper, but none of it gave me the sharp satisfaction I'd expected. Maeve filed for separation within a week of the indictment. I heard about it from a neighbor of theirs, not from Maeve herself. "She's blaming him for all of it," the neighbor told me over the phone, her voice thick with gossip. "Says he dragged her down." Maybe he did. Maybe she let him. Owen, once the man who controlled every word spoken in our family, now walked the grocery aisles alone. People looked away when he passed, even the ones who used to call him sir. The silence he once used to control others now surrounded him like a cage. I didn't care. I didn't need an apology. I didn't need revenge. I just needed peace. And so I went home. Not to my small apartment, but to Ada's house. It was officially mine now, after the judge's final ruling. But standing on the porch that first morning, keys in hand, I realized how little that meant. Ownership wasn't victory. It wasn't justice. It was just a set of walls that had once held a woman I loved. I stepped inside. The air smelled faintly of lavender and old cedar. Memories lingered in every corner, in every creak of the floorboards. I didn't speak. I just started moving. I opened the windows. I stripped the yellow dust covers from the furniture. I let sunlight find its way back into the rooms. And in the small garden Ada once tended with such care, I dug my bare hands into the dry, neglected soil. I replanted her lilies, the ones she'd loved, the ones I had watched wither after she left. It wasn't much, but it was something. I didn't tell anyone. No announcements, no social media posts, no triumphant victory speech. I simply lived. Weeks passed. One morning, while drinking coffee on Ada's porch, I looked at the house with different eyes. It didn't feel like a possession anymore. It felt like history. And I realized that history needed to mean more than betrayal. So, I called the local community center. It wasn't hard to explain. I wanted to donate the house. Not for profit, for purpose. That became its new name, Ada's House. A shelter for elders who had been abandoned or forgotten, just as Ada had been. The opening ceremony was small, modest. Just the way she would have wanted. I stood in the back, letting the volunteers and the center's director take the spotlight. They deserved it. Someone, probably a volunteer, maybe a neighbor, had hung a red scarf above the entryway that morning. They didn't know. They couldn't have. But I saw it. And for a moment, I couldn't move. The scarf swayed lightly in the morning breeze. A simple piece of cloth. But to me, it was a symbol, not of pain, but of survival. I didn't explain. I didn't need to. I just breathed in slowly and let the moment pass. People smiled at me as they passed by. Some said, "Thank you." Others simply nodded. I nodded back. Later that evening, as I walked home to my own small, quiet apartment, I thought about the word family. For years, it had meant a kind of prison. Obligation, fear, silence. But standing on that porch today, I'd seen something different. Sometimes family isn't who raises you. It's who stands beside you when standing costs everything. I never forgave Owen. I never forgave Maeve. But I stopped carrying them with me. And that, I found, felt like enough. As I reached my own front door, I looked back once across the street. The red scarf still fluttered gently above the entrance of Ada's house, and I knew she was free. And so was I,